Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am glad to be able to give this talk, and I'd like to acknowledge the invitation by the organizers of the conference and my co-authors, Clara Armaroli from the US Pavia and Paolo BILLI from the University of Ferrara, as well as Tottori University in Japan. As you can see from the title of the talk, the topic we are dealing with is slightly different from the other topics presented at the conference, but somehow are related together, which is basically the importance of sediment supply from rivers to river mouths in the Mediterranean. The talk will deal with a number of aspects of this topic, but basically we will consider systems which have been strongly affected by changes in the sediment supply, as well as engineering works at the mouths. We will consider changes in sediment delivery, changes in the energy of the river system, and also changes in delta geometry. It is based on a number of papers published by my group as well as other authors, and you will always find a reference in each slide to be able to track the paper on which the work is based on. Now, we should remember the importance of the role of catchments in supplying sediment. You can see in this animation how the sediment produced within basins without structures is delivered throughout the alluvial plains to the coastline and enters the coastal budget. If we have a sink halfway through, like a dam, clearly this is decreasing or is actually stopping the sediment supply to the coastal sediment budget. And with time, you can see coastal erosion. This, for example, is the main problem that has affected the Italian coastlines in the last 50 years. The fact that together with the development after World War II, there was demand for hydroelectric power as well as water storage, and finally also for aggregates. And sediment was actually being captured, taken out on alluvial plains. Now we can see that if we look at this from the space, it is evident the role of river mouths to nearby beaches. This image of the shuttle of the Po Delta, you can see the river plume. You can track how this is going to supply sediment to these beaches. And this is an example not so far from the site of this conference, which is Albania. It is a Landsat image in false colors, and you can see that the plume is actually extending quite far away from the river mouths. Clearly, most of this is suspended sediment. What it is important for the survival of beaches is more the bed load in the form of sand and or gravel. Obviously, it depends what kind of river you are considering. Now, this role of interaction at river mouths was firstly described in this paper by Wright in 1977, which took a number of examples from around the world and identified three forcing parameters able to control the mouth morphology. On one hand, you have the role of tides. On the other hand, the role of the river, the sediment supply and the effluent by the river, and finally the role of the waves. According to this diagram, you have three different classes. If you have dominance of tides, you will have a typical estuary. If you have the role of river, which is dominant, you will have a dictated delta, like the Mississippi Delta, for example. If you have an important role of waves, so you are exposed to quite energetic seas, you will have the classical Greek delta letter shape. Now, when the river discharge enters the sea, you have an important role by the strength of the outflow. You have a lot of friction at the bed, which is enhancing sediment deposition. And finally, the fine sediment will outflow as a buoyant plume towards the open sea. Now, if we look at the Adriatic Sea, for example, there is this interesting review work of Milliman, which looked at the sediment input into the basin before the dams were constructed. And according to them, the role is dominant from rivers in the southern Adriatic. You can see a comparison here between the basin area and the mean annual sediment discharge in million tons per year. And you can see that normally the rivers from northern Italy have large basins, but do not produce as much sediment as they do the rivers of central Italy, and especially the rivers of Albania. This is due to the landscape. These are areas, the Apennines and the whole Balkan areas have quite high mountains close to the coast. So the base slope is very large, and the behavior of this river is very variable throughout the year with, for example, flash floods. So you can see that it can be quite misleading to just use the basin area as a proxy of sediment supply to the coast. This is true on a worldwide level. It is a review we published some years ago where we plotted the main river systems in the world, like the Mississippi, the Rio de la Plata, the Amazons, and so forth, together with the rivers of Albania. And these are rivers from Asia, typically Taiwan and Indonesia. You can see that these systems with a very small basin can produce a lot of sediment. This is a very important thing regarding the sediment discharge into the oceans. Now, we have the classic example of Schum, which described the concept of river continuum, the area where you produce the sediment in the catchment. The sediment is transferred through slope erosion to the alluvial plain, and finally you have the dominant deposition at the mouth. Now, recently somebody has proposed a reverse Schum's model, where you have a decrease in sediment production in the catchments due to, for example, reforestation and soil conservation practices. This decreases the sediment delivery to the alluvial plain, and you only have left some point sediment sources. But in the alluvial plain or in the Pedemontaneous area, you have dams, you start to have river mining, and you also have levees which protect the alluvial plain from flooding, so decrease the amount of sediment which is stored there. This typically leads to riverbed degradation, and finally to a reduced sediment supply to the coast, causing beach erosion. We can see this type of phenomenon taking as example the rivers of Albania. Albania has a peculiar story because at quite a natural coastline. You can see this comparison up to the 1950s of these three rivers, the Scumbini, the Semani, and the Viose. Out of the three, you can see that the Semani at a certain point had changed its position of the mouth due to river engineering works, because these areas used for agriculture. When the land use practice change, after the revolution, and the country decreases agricultural interest in the coastal zone, the river went back to this original position. So we could actually talk about man-made deltas. Many of the deltas that we have in the Mediterranean are fully man-made. The Po is a man-made delta, was artificially created by the Venetians diverting rivers. Here we have the example of the Semani River, which was in a position due to river engineering works when fluvial processes were dominant, which did not coincide with its natural position, less river dominated. And eventually, when the land practice changed, the river actually switched out completely to a wave dominated environment due to a lower sediment discharge. So in what we call now the Anthropocene, man had a very important role. And this role is explicited through the construction of dams and river engineering works. This is a review work of Mariner, which plotted for the main rivers in the Mediterranean the changes in sediment discharge observed in recent times due to the construction of dams and the sediment loss. This is of interest not only to small systems. Normally, you have the examples of the larger river systems like the Nile Delta following the construction of the Aswan Dam. You can see in this diagram below that once the Aswan Dam was constructed, sediment discharge decreased. This is a subsiding area. You started to have a relative sea level rise observed and a dramatic land loss change. But this applies to smaller systems as well. The point is that normally is not in the literature, it's less described. This is some work which looked at this problem worldwide, and in fact, they were able to identify the 1970s as a threshold in the sediment loss in river systems. You can see a number of river systems plotted here. Many are in the Mediterranean, like the Ebro, the Magra, that is one of the case studies of this talk. And generally, you can see everywhere this signal of a certain point when the effect of man was so large that triggered an important loss of fluvial sediment supply. Now, if we go back to the Mediterranean and we look a little bit not only into the Adriatic, but also the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas, there are some examples which tend to have the same signal. In this talk, we will look at a river system here, which is the joining of the Lamone and Savio River. We will look at the Maga River between Toscana and Liguria here, and we look at the Simeto River in Sicily. This is a review work of Milliman, which looked at published data in Adriatic rivers. One of the main problems of this kind of information, and normally it is very difficult, if not impossible, to find information on bed loads. At the best, the only type of information that you can find regards suspended load or total load of rivers. But still, there is very little data available. Now, the first case study that we are looking at is this Fiumuniti, is south of Ravenna. It is created by the joining of the Montone and Ronco River. They have these two, the one in red and one in green. They have a total catchment area of about 1,200 square kilometers. And they're not particularly long rivers. We have got the Apennines quite close to the coast. But the steep area is only in the Apennine area. The rest of the time, the rivers are flowing through a very human-modified coastal plain. The other example that we look here is the Lido di Savio, the Savio River mouth. This is a much smaller system. It's about half the catchment compared to the previous ones. And the length of the system, it is quite comparable. Now, if we look at the historical evolution, this area, it is quite variable because we had in 1943 no human presence at all, but already you can see there was no delta, unlike what it was in 1851, where you had a very well developed delta. Throughout the 1950s, 1970s, and to the present, this mouth continued to erode. And you can see that, in fact, it is just what it can be resembled to a small estuary. There is a water ingression of kilometers from the mouth due to the high tides. The Savio mouth far to the south has an even worse story, because in 1943, you can see that, again, there was no delta visible, unlike there was in 1851. Actually, there was a very large delta, which was not coincident with the mouth that there was at the time, because these areas were subject to land reclamation. So in the 1980s, this river mouth had completely transformed into an inlet, and there was a number of engineering works which you can see still now. Obviously, in the Adriatic, you have a little bit of tidal range, so you could argue that the tides are important in controlling these. So we'll move to the Tyrrhenian Sea, where the tidal range is almost negligible. We are talking just tens of centimeters against almost 1 meter in the Adriatic. Here we take as example the Magra mouth. It is a river which is outflowing in a coastal cell between the Cinque Terre headland, this is a hilly area, and a very large port built before World War II. Here the river is with the steep slopes, so it has a considerable sediment transport, and it has a much larger basin compared to the previous ones. You can see the catchment here, and in fact is a river which is in the upper catchment is normally interested by flash floods, also for the climatology of the area, for the type of rainfall distribution that you have. Now, here, if we compare what it was the situation before the impact of man in 1882, you can see you have a very large beach. Sediment transport is to the southeast. And following the construction of this port, you had a huge sediment deposition against the port, but you can see here that in 1954 you also had a huge erosion of the mouth. And then some structures had to be built to the fact that at the moment you have the same position of the coastline of the 1950s. Why did this happen? If we go and use some historical maps, there are a lot of evidences that this river system was very productive for what concerns sediment. You can see this 1773 map, which shows shoals and large islands close to the mouth. This 1834 maps was actually mapping some islands even farther inland. And also we managed to find some pictures from the 1930s, and you can see here a topographic map of 1928. You can see the ships had to navigate with special care when they were entering the mouth because of these shoals. We managed to do a reconstruction using historical bathymetric maps. This is a paper published in Marine Geology. And we quantified that between 1882 and 2000, there was a loss of about 3 million cubic meters. 3 million cubic meters, of which 1.8 million cubic meters just in the period 1954-2000. We compared this with some information on aggregate extraction, which was done farther inland along the river course, and we found that between 1958 and 1973, almost 24 million cubic meters were taken out. This was mainly done for the construction of a coastal motorway. Finally, we take a less known example, which is the Simeto river mouth. Unfortunately, here there is less literature. The only paper which is published, this paper by Longhitano and Colena from 2007, is a much large system. It's the largest river in Sicily, outflows at the border of the Etna volcano. You can see here is more than twice the catchment of the Magra. And there is some estimation of sediment load, which are about 1 million tons per year, obviously before the impact of man. Here the sediment transport is consisting of very fine sand to silt, so bed load is not very large. And the work of the colleagues identified that up to the 19th century, this river was advancing. And then at a certain point, you can start to see an inverse trend. Here there was a huge policy of land reclamation, of drainage of the coastal plain, and especially after World War II, a huge dam and artificial lake was created. If we look at satellite imagery, there is still evidence of sediment supply to the coast. You can see this satellite image captured after flood, a huge quantity of sediment in suspension, interesting the mouth, but if you go and see an image after some time, you can see that the mouth is almost closed. You can see a very weak sign of submerged delta, but clearly not the large delta that historically was present. Here we have the same problem of salinization of agricultural soils, of tidal ingression very far from the mouth, which has important implications for agriculture. So concluding, if we look at the literature, normally you know that after the last glaciation, sea level started to rise. As a response to sea level rise and the end of glaciations, there was an increase in sediment production within basins. So what we had that river, the lowest part of river courses started to silt up, to fill up. And eventually, deltas started to build. This is, for example, true in many Mediterranean deltas. This is a delta in France, studied by colleagues, and you can see this trend pretty well. Also keep in mind that archaeology supplied a lot of information in these cases. What we are seeing here is just the opposite. You have a situation where river coastal plains are starting to be flooded, or if they're not flooded because you are levees to stop that, the river is losing sediment, it's becoming deeper, and is becoming like an estuary, despite the fact that we are talking of rivers in areas where the tidal range is rather small. To conclude, what are the reasons for that? Well, changes in land use. In many Mediterranean areas, there was huge reforestation. This has decreased sediment supply. There was, after World War II, a huge demand for aggregates. In Italy, for example, this has officially stopped in the 1980s. But this has impoverished the sediment budget for decades. And also, there was the need for construction of engineering structures to decrease sediment supply, to keep sediment at certain points along the riverbeds. We should not forget the role of dams. Dams were built for hydroelectric power production, water supply, and they trap sediment. Many of these dams at the moment in Italy are filled up. They cannot perform to the target for which they were built. Now, this problem of estuarization of small river mouths has important impacts of agriculture, as I said, and there is also the deterioration of groundwater, because many of the aquifers, the superficial aquifers, are connected to the rivers. This is a topic which is relevant not only to Italy, we believe, but to many Mediterranean countries, has been overlooked because we only looked at large river systems, and time has come to act. In the context of climate change, we should consider to restart sediment production on slopes, obviously in a controlled manner, and start discussing with the companies and the authorities that manage dams to start considering sediment bypassing. And finally, whenever maintenance works or engineering structures is done, we should consider bypassing of the alluvial plain and reusing this sediment for beach replenishment. As a gift to the country hosting this conference, I'd like to show this image of the Boia Laguna, according to the way you call it, river delta at the border between Montenegro and Albania. Well, this is a system which is quite healthy still. You can see there is no occupation at all. It has the typical Greek letter delta shape. And here there is a lot of evidence of sediment supply to the nearby beaches. My message here, our message here, take care of it. This is something which is very hardly found in other parts of the Mediterranean coastline, and you should be very careful to whatever you do in the upper catchment, in the alluvial plain. This is going to reflect onto the coastline. With this, I thank the organizers, I thank the speakers, and I'm open to questions.